All right. Welcome, everybody, to our most recent, oh, fuck. I screw up all the time. Welcome to Seeds for Growth. We're so excited to be talking with Sarah Dennis and Miriam Bhimani. See, I haven't had enough coffee.
Inspired, Dora.
I'm inspired here, right? So we're really excited to have you here. This is a really important topic, which is anti-racism. It's in the workplace, but it's actually all over, right? How do we deal with anti-racism? How do we show up as people who understand this more and who are really digging into this conversation? So I'm going to first introduce Dr. Sandra Dennis. She is an anti-bias, anti-racism consultant and organizer, as well as an adjunct professor of education at Loyola and UIC. She has taught and coached teachers at NYU as well, Erickson Institute, Roosevelt University, and the Ounce of Prevention Fund in New York City and Chicago for over 17 years. Sarah has a bachelor's in early education, elementary education, and a master's in literacy, and a doctorate in education, all from NYU. And since moving back to Chicago in 2015, she founded and co-leads NAME Illinois, which is the state chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education. And a lot more than that. She is currently collaborating to get CPS, Chicago Public Schools, to change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, and has collected over 1,000 signatures to date. And you can add your signature to her petition. Then Miriam has also worked in and around schools for the past 15 years. She is a classroom teacher, reading specialist, as well as a professional developer. And she has worked in public schools, charter schools, and within the private school network. Miriam is a member of the International Literacy Association and ASC. And I would challenge you to say that out loud, as it just doesn't quite flow sometimes. Miriam has worked with and trained district level staff, principals, and teachers to work with instructional technology in their schools and classrooms. So that is leveraged for student learning and equity. She's worked on federal grants, and she currently works with schools on best practices in equitable school infrastructure, including how to identify areas of improvement and processes for that improvement. And with that, I welcome you to this Seeds for Growth on anti-racism.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you all for being here. I know we have a brief time together, so just a brief introduction that this is just going to be the tip of the iceberg. We hope that you'll want to learn a lot more, and we're going to give you as many tools as we can in a very short amount of time. So we're going to start with a little bit more introduction.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that introduction. You went through our credentials very well. So I think for my introduction, I'll explain a little bit more about my background. You'll see the picture is with me and my father, who is from India and grew up in the time of partition. And I think his history really flowed through me. He, when India was partitioned, his family moved to what was then East Pakistan, and then subsequently grew up in a civil war between East and West Pakistan before emigrating to the United States. And that became really important in my upbringing and my adult life as I came to terms with being biracial in the United States. I think I'll get a little more into that as we go through this presentation, but that's really important to know off the top. And then I'll hand it over to Sarah to add her bit.
Thanks. And that picture is my daughter when she was 2 and almost 3. She was still 2 though, at the Springfield Museum, Abraham Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois. If people haven't been there, I highly recommend it. It's very experiential with all these mannequins. And there was a scene with a mom, dad, and child enslaved African or descendant of somebody from Africa with shackles, and the mom mannequin had tears on her face, and there were 3 white owners of people standing behind them. So I've really been working on my own language around this. I'm trying not to use the word slave as a noun, but enslaved people and people who are enslaved. So we don't take away the verb part of the enslavement. Anyway, she said, "Mommy, why is she crying?" And I thought, oh my gosh, I don't want to lie to her, but she's 2, and I'm not really sure what to say right now, but I told her the truth. I actually told her that a long, long time ago in the history of this country, people, the three white men in the back had huge farms. They needed people to work on the farms to pick cotton and grow different crops. And they actually stole people from where they lived in Africa and put them on boats and brought them here and made them work and did not treat them well. And I didn't go into the rape, but I did explain that they were being separated from each other, that the mom was going to go to one farm and the dad was going to go to another farm and the boy was going to go to a different farm, and they were incredibly sad. And she was fairly distressed and kind of like, how could people do that to people? Rightly so. Not upset, not crying, but just like, that's really effed up. From a 2-year-old, she was just like, who does that to people? And that was really the beginning of my journey of really diving into the research around young children and how does bias develop and what do we do about it as parents, as teachers, as teacher educators. How can we help kids learn and families learn and teachers learn that color blindness is really, really damaging and has done all of us a disservice, and there's an incredible amount of racism. And so she's now 10 and a half. And so for the past, I would say 8 years, I've really been digging into the research. And so we want to start out, you're going to start?
Yeah, I think we were also, Sarah and I are fairly certain that we've crossed paths in New York, although I haven't been able to pinpoint exactly where. And I think one of the things I should note in my bio too is that I've now worked in 3 major urban centers, Chicago, Detroit, and New York. And so oftentimes when I run into people, it's like, well, which city have you been in? Because
you were in New York at the same time.
Yeah.
Pretty sure we attended a conference together or something.
Right. So if we seem conversational here today, that's why.
And we reconnected through another women's Will this summer, where I was a co-presenter with Corey Wallace from Evanston, and we did a training on talking to young children about racism. And I reconnected there, and we're happy to be here with you today.
Exactly. So this group agreement slide is twofold. One, it's to set the norms for us going through this presentation itself. And 2, if you are someone in either a workplace or an organization, an environment where you think you need some normed goals for how to have a conversation, this is a good slide to use as a model as well. So the first group agreement is to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. There are things we might say today that you either maybe weren't aware of, haven't had enough education around, which is true for all of us. And that's okay. To be uncomfortable is okay. And it's one of the best ways to learn. And to go with that is to expect and accept non-closure. You might not get answers to everything that you want answers to. Speaking your individual truth is a big one. So using I statements instead of you statements, I, me, and not we and us. Staying engaged, which I know is hard to do on a webinar, and we can't keep you accountable to that. But when you're in the presence of real people in real life, staying engaged is a really big sign of respect. It's really important. And that leads right into being respectful and open-minded and having a growth mindset. We all have opportunities to grow. And so remembering that for everyone in the room is really important, being empathetic to that as well. Trying to listen to understand instead of already thinking about what you'll say in response. Very important to having an honest conversation, I'd say. And monitoring your airtime goes with that. So making sure that you're not taking up the space in the room. The space you take up is really important, and it signals something Sarah has pointed out, I say a lot, the space that I take up. It signals how important you are in the hierarchy of that group that you're in. If you're taking up all the space, then there's not enough space for other people to play around in that conversation. So one good rule is 3 people before you speak. A second time, right? So, and to not continue on. And avoid shaming others when they do speak. So oftentimes, just as it says on the slide, we judge others by their worst examples while giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt. So learning to be empathetic to those around us is really crucial to having honest conversations. And the biggest one for me is always focusing on the impact over the intent. The intent really goes nowhere if the impact is zero. So I think that those are some, it's not always that you have to use all 9 agreements in every conversation you're having, but they're good to keep in mind and a good model to use when you are trying to norm a conversation, especially around touchy subjects like racism.
So we didn't actually name that as one of our tools. We have 6 other tools we're going to introduce you to formally, but I'd actually think we could add this. Tool 0 is setting up some agreements when you're in a work setting or in a religious institution or in school, and that we're coming from the same place. And we do agree, and sometimes people have already raised their hand if you agree. And we're not going to have as much dialogue today as we would if we were in the same room and had more time. But did want to introduce that to you. It's pretty important to start out with. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've both been sharing a bit about ourselves, and that's actually me in kindergarten. The second row, I'm sorry I didn't circle it, just to the right of all the words. That's me with a headband when I was 5. And I went to a Chicago public school by Cabrini Green in the 80s when busing for racial integration was a court mandate, actually. And so there were kids from Cabrini who walked, and then there were kids bused in from all over the rest of racially segregated Chicago, including myself. And it wasn't until I started doing this work that I counted up everybody, and the white was not the majority. And that really struck me because there really wasn't one single majority. It was about 30, 30, 30, Black, Latinx, Asian, white. I'm sorry, that wouldn't be right. 25% each. Anyway, and then we had one Native girl who joined us later. It was really amazing. But social group identities, you can see that definition there, are denoted by membership, defined by society. So being a woman, being this racial category called white, being temporarily able-bodied, and very different than my mom in the middle there in the photo is she passed away when I was in college. And I like to bring her into the space when I can. She was a huge influence on my life, including, I think, why I went to that elementary school, who I miss tremendously. And that's an individual identity of mine that I can connect with other people about, but it's not ever been legislated. So even though Mother's Day is really, really hard for me, it's one of my least favorite days of the year, even as a mother, it's not a social group identity. Being a motherless daughter or a motherless mother isn't a social group identity, it's an individual identity. And this definition is from CROR. If you've never heard of CROR, Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism, they do really amazing 2.5-day anti-racism trainings in Chicago that I'd highly recommend.
We're going to show you a clip from Maya Angelou herself. I happen to love her. And before we get into the teaching tools that we have, I think this will really set the stage for us.
Maybe the hardest part is not as I do, but do as I say. No. You have to say, I'm doing my best to do what I do.
Sarah and Miriam, I think we're having some trouble with the audio.
I can't hear anything either.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, then we can move on then.
Okay.
But that's good to know for the future links that we might have had set up.
Sorry about that. We did test it before. I'm not sure why that didn't work. Do you want to just summarize or say anything about it?
I think we can move on right to the privilege wheel.
Okay.
We'll jump right into the tools then. So then this is tool 1, which Sarah will talk a little bit about, and I might jump in a bit.
Sure. So if we were in a workshop together, I would have this as a handout. And I would ask you to, and you can do this activity with others, read across the top, starting at like 9 o'clock on the clock to 3 o'clock. Each of those identities, social group identities, has a line that's a continuum to the opposite, below the dark line in the middle. And so you can read, like, for example, male, the second one up from 9 o'clock, And then if you look across to the bottom, it's female. And so just having everybody place themselves, and it's not necessarily binary, but placing a little X of sort of where do you fall on that continuum for each of those identities, reading across all of the top. And then sometimes people count how many are social group identities that have been privileged historically in this country and how many have experienced oppression. And then I often will have people turn and talk to a colleague and share, how would your life be different if one of those was different? And that is a powerful exercise to think about. If I was male, or if I was Black, or if I was in a wheelchair, how might my life be different? And so this is a tool to start a lot of self-reflection and then also conversation.
I think it's also interesting to talk to people if you do have a space where you can share on this privilege wheel, because you'll often hear or see things that you weren't expecting as the oppressive force in their life, potentially. Like, you may not know by looking at someone that they are of a minority religion and understand the difference between the majority religion being an oppressive force in this country versus not. You may not know, for example, and I'll get into this in the next couple of slides too, when someone is passing or not. And depending on when they're using that privilege or when they're being oppressed. The other thing that Sarah and I had talked about specifically in the workplace, when you get to a point of wanting to enact a policy, and because some of these privileges and oppressive natures are unseen or can be unseen, it might be a useful tool to use to anonymize the data. And so you can have people fill these out and turn them in without a name, so you can aggregate some of the data that comes from this, so you're more understanding at the top of your organization of what's going on around you.
And that makes me think of even making it a Google form, so it's really anonymous, because if it's all of the identities clustered together, it might be obvious who it is from gender and race and other identities that you are familiar with. So taking these terms, especially the sort of the inner, where you see where it says genderism, androcentrism, racism, Eurocentrism, and looking them up. If you're not familiar with them, that's also a really good place to start. What does that mean? How much do I know about that already? Is that an area of growth for me where I've never heard of, pronatalism, where it says fertile and non-fertile? And as a mother, as a woman who has had a child, I am on the privileged side of that. And in conversations with people who have been infertile, it can be a very painful, minoritized group because of the dominant fertileness. Part of it's through Christianity and the settling of this country, but it just things that we haven't always thought about.
And so that's one thing to keep in mind, especially when you're in a workplace, is you need to assess where you are as a workplace and an organization, so you know where your gaps are and where you can grow. So that's keeping that growth mindset. It's not a shame on you sort of thing. It's, this is where we are and this is where we want to be. And in order to know that, you do really need to assess what's going on in the organization. And one part of that is our next tool, which will help clarify the communication between people and among maybe systems within your organization. Understanding your own lens, understanding your own self is really important to beginning to be able to understand other people. And so this tool comes from Robin DiAngelo, and it's called the Frames and References. So you'll see the sunglasses, and I'll go through I'll model a little bit, going through some of these frames and references. So you'll see on the sunglasses themselves, you see the different groups: gender, citizenship, age, religion, class, sexuality, ability, and race. So for example, for religion, you might ask, were you raised with a certain religious tradition? And for me, as I'm going to model this, I have two parents who are of two completely separate religions. And that's quite common in the United States. My father is Muslim and my mother is Methodist-ish, which is also quite common. And so what that meant was that I had a mixed upbringing for religions, which is not something that you'd know about me unless you asked or unless I volunteered that information. What it also means is that I'm very well aware when I don't know what's going on in Christianity, and when I can see that Christianity is the guiding force, right? It's why I can see certain elements of school calendars that are centered around that, because they're not centered around the holidays that my father celebrates. And in fact, I would often have to take those days off separately. They were non-attendance days, but they were not built into the calendar. And that framed how I grew up. That was a form of othering that I experienced. And if we go into why we're all here today to talk about the racist portions of our society, which would be all of it, race is a really big one. Again, if you haven't gathered, my father obviously is from India, but my mother is from the States and she's white. And so not only did I have a mixed religion upbringing, I had a mixed race upbringing. And I'm very sensitive to whitewashing in that way because my mother is white and sought to teach me what she knew. And that was all about white culture and white history and the predominant culture in this country. While my father really took a back seat to the raising of kids because that was part of his culture. And because of that, I was really forced into a whitewashed upbringing and had to reckon with that growing up. On the flip side of that, that also means that I'm able to pass in ways where I might not have been if my dad had taken more of the reins. Because I understand certain white spaces or traditional white spaces, I know the cultural norms that go with those. So I know how to behave, basically. It's always a dangerous position to be passing, and I'm very aware of that now. And anytime someone is passing around you, they could always be outed from that position. And it's important to be sensitive to that because there's always a power structure that I'm playing to in that role. And so sometimes I can use passing as a privilege, but sometimes it's very oppressive because it means I have to behave a certain way. And that's the only way I can stay in this space.
And so here's some of my social group identities put into that same frame with white very large. And the takeaway really is that all of those social group identities and the intersectionality of those identities affect your lens and how you see the world. And we can't not see the world through those lenses. And because of the history of this country with genocide of Native people and chattel slavery, the entire foundation of this country's history has been on race. And then secondarily, I would say gender would probably be the next most in terms of the government, which we're going to look at in a second. Implicit bias is another self-reflection, and there's a tool where you can take implicit bias association tests through Harvard. We'll show you the link in just a second. And it's basically just that it's out of your consciousness. You're not aware of it. You're not even in control of it. And we all do it, and they can be favorable and unfavorable. It's not all bad. It's human nature to learn when the stove is hot and you touch it, not to do that again, that's dangerous and it hurts. And so our brain works that way from infancy of sorting and categorizing, and so much of it's implicit and has been socialized into us from very, very young ages. So here's the link. If you just Google Harvard implicit bias test or implicit association test, it'll come up. And basically, just briefly, it shows you photographs. The one on the left there, I know it's very small, but the idea is you're doing it so quickly that you don't have time to think about it. So it shows you one photo at a time, and you're sorting them into categories, which is 2 fingers. You have your fingers on the keys, and you're sorting them for this one particular as either foreign or American, and then Native American and white. So it shows you a series of photos, first the landmarks, and then the people, and then it switches which category goes on which side, and then it also has an association of like good with Native and bad with white, and then it switches good with white and bad with Native. And so the whole idea is that you don't have time to think about it. And these are the results on the right. I know you're not expected to read that, but just to see the graph, that 22% had a strong automatic association with white as American and Native as foreign. And so if you add up the three purple, it's 59% of 214,000 people who have taken it over the past 10 years showed a bias for white as American and Native American as foreign. It's very interesting. And a lot of it came up through our socialization in schools and the history books. So there's about 13 of them: gender, race, religion. There's a size one about fat and thin. I've actually taken all of them now to look at, and then it gives you your own results of, did you have a strong association, a moderate, a slight, no preference, or then a slight in the other direction, or moderate or strong. And then it'll show you the results of everybody else who's taken it. Up to 1 million people have taken different ones. Super, super interesting. I think each one takes maybe 10 minutes. I would highly, highly recommend, even if you just do one of them to get started.
And so the next tool is really a way for you to try to assess your organization structurally. It's a continuum of what organizations can look like. And rubrics like these will often address just the compliance aspects, the federal and state level, sometimes city level compliance issues. They'll often address whether or not you have diversity officers within your organization, how your hiring and retention processes are for people of color, and how you integrate diversity into your actual model of operation. So the next slide,
and we're not expecting you to read this. Don't be stressed. We'll email it to you.
Yeah, we don't want you to read through this continuum, but I do want, this is one example of a rubric that you could use in assessing your own organization. And so I'll go through the top headings and then kind of double back. So the first box is an exclusionary institution that's intentionally excluding people, segregating people.
Which is basically illegal now. So most organizations don't fall in the category that should have a number 1 next to it. There's just a little typo on this version.
Right. Then the next box is a passive institution. So they're okay with certain amounts of people of color. There are token people around, but they might still really sort of limit the number of people who can be of color within the institution. They may outwardly say that they maintain a balanced composition, but still may internally limit that composition. And the third one is symbolic change. This is a compliance organization, an organization that is following federal legislation, local legislation, city legislation. But they're not really looking to do more than that. That's pretty much where the buck stops with the law as it is. The fourth box is identity change and an affirming institution. So they're trying to learn and they're trying to do better. They are creating structures and analyzing how the racism within the organization is operating. And I think when I double back, there's usually a big gulf between a compliance organization and an affirming institution. An affirming institution is trying to undo the racism that they know exists. Do you have anything to add?
No.
There? Okay. A transforming institution commits to making the changes. They're doing more than just learning about it and trying to understand what to do. They are doing it. They are trying to enact those changes. They're running audits. They're using something like a continuum often so that they can continually reassess what they're doing. And the sixth box is fully inclusive, anti-racist, and multicultural organization in a transformed society. So wider community effort is involved. They're trying to overcome systemic racism, all forms of oppression.
So nobody's really ever gotten there
Right.
before. It's an aspirational level because of the transformation in society that would require. So it's a tool not only for self-reflection, yourself and your role, but also for everybody. I was in a training with a large national nonprofit where there were about 40 people in the room who all were asked to self-assess right there on the spot. And they had already done it with about another, I think, 200 of the staff around the country. And it was pretty unanimous that they were like between a 2 and a 3. And that's really where most organizations live. 3, if you see above that row where Miriam just read the labels, it says monocultural with an arrow, multicultural, and that has been the goal. That was the goal for some decades, is multicultural. And so people who have gotten to a 3 have sometimes felt like they've arrived, because that was the aspiration. And people who've been really digging into this work over some decades are starting to talk about that's maybe not actually enough. Even though that's where the law stops, it's not really working.
Well, and it felt aspirational too, because it took so many decades to get the law, to get the compliance on the books. And so then people have been given lots of leeway to get compliance in order. And so it's felt like this heavy lift for everyone to get compliance to where it needs to be. But really, we need compliance before you can get to some of the other aspects, before you can affirm people's existence as people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry. So has anybody heard anybody say these things or thought these things yourself? Go ahead and read these statements.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah, please.
So I was recalling, this is Liz, I was recalling several years ago when I was writing something for something, that there's that song on Sesame Street that is at least from the mid 80s. And it's all, we all sing with the same voice, which is sort of, all of you may remember that, but I keep thinking about that. And that's the message I grew up with. At least on the top part there about color blindness, and it's all the same. So it's a nice message and it's a cute song, but it may be a little more damaging than actually productive.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It's a perfect example.
I
You're
thought-
welcome.
I thought-
Pardon my singing.
Well, I would say we can see how that expands upward into the adult universe now when we see movements like Black Lives Matter, and the counter to it that we see that I always
All
prickle
lives
at is
matter.
all lives matter, and think like, well, somebody is missing the point here, right? If we're able to jump to that so quickly.
And I also
it's hard. Most of us are not, let me go back. How many people feel like you had expert teachers in talking about race and racism, between family, teachers, maybe a religious institution or some other community organization, nonprofit? Generally, not very many people raise their hand when I'm in a real room with 100 people. Sorry, this feels very odd. Most of us are doing this without models who have come, because colorblindness was the message for some decades.
Yes.
And so coming out of that to realize that actually that was really problematic. It's a nice aspiration, but the reality is that racism is so much deeper than that. And so this is our tool 5, the 4 dimensions of racism adapted from Race Forward. And so again, we're going to email all of these, not the whole PowerPoint, but the individual tools that are either PDFs or links to the tools that you can have them all. And we're just giving you a brief introduction to them right now.
Right, and I'll break these out even farther. So the 2 overarching dimensions are individual and systemic, and within individual racism, you see internalized and interpersonal, and within systemic, you see institutional and structural. So I'll dig into the individual racism. In internalized, it's what you yourself believe about yourself. So oftentimes for people of color, you really can't avoid some form of internalized oppression. People of color are often taught that the melanin in our skin is not a good attribute in this country, and it's something we have to work around. And so it's very easy to internalize that and not treat our skin as a celebratory aspect of our lives. And on the flip side of that, people who are white and don't have a lot of melanin in their skin have internalized a superiority. And I would add to that, and we had added to that, entitlement. There's a high sense of entitlement that goes with that. And in fact, I was at a discussion about race in this country, and one of the professors noted that oftentimes white men in particular fail upwards. It's very easy for white men to fail upwards because they are operating on this internalized superiority and this sense of entitlement, whereas people of color really only get one shot at something, and you have to do it perfectly or above perfectly to even have a chance at that promotion or that next step. That's one form of an individual racism. The other one is interpersonal, and these are interactions that we have every day with people around us. How we act upon what we believe with the people and systems around us. So when we ask offensive questions, the one I get most often, and depending on the situation that I'm in, answer differently, but the one I get most often is, where are you from? Sometimes that means what city do I live in? If someone keeps drilling down on that information, it often means I don't look like I'm American, as Sarah was noting in the implicit bias tool, that often people associate white with American. So because I'm not fully white, where am I from means what country of origin is my ethnicity and race? Like those questions start to feel way more dangerous. And then I start to wonder why people are collecting that information, because it appears as though those questions are not honest. And then the other example that Sarah added in is white children touching black children's hair. Really any texture, really touching other people that don't look like you, just to see what that feels like or is like, is really a form of interpersonal racism. As is the slide that we talked about, have you heard these things? Saying I don't see color or all lives matter, those are versions of individual racism as well. Were you gonna add something? Okay. So then the systemic racism pieces are really what's around, it's the air we breathe all the time. And so the institutional racism is how we act upon, oh, did I put that separately? I might not have copied that correctly, but how resources, I'll skip to the examples. Yeah, sorry, there's a typo there. Yeah. The inequities that we see within the institution. So in Chicago, for example, this is an easier one to notice. The Chicago Park District is a pretty good institution in this city that's separate from other cities. We don't have this. But you'll notice a giant difference between North Side parks, South Side parks, West Side parks, Far South Side parks, and how those resources are allocated. And so that's institutional. That Chicago Park District might allocate within itself how it fixes equipment across the city, who has access to being able to call those problems in. Those kinds of things are institutional racism. When we get to talking about structural racism, we're talking about the school to prison pipeline. We're talking about laws on the books, right? What we criminalize and what we don't criminalize. Who is penalized for those things and who is not penalized for those things, in particular around drugs and incarceration, stopping and frisking. Those kinds of things are more structural. And I think a large part of this as well that continues to play into our systemic racism is how housing and redlining occurred in this country. And so we ended up with segregated neighborhoods as a result of those policies, as well as how highways were built in this country. The major highways were built and there was no thought to cutting across historical Black neighborhoods that were vibrant.
Or it was done on purpose.
Or it was done on purpose.
To destroy vibrant Black neighborhoods.
So when we see things like Black Lives Matter protests taking over highways, that's on purpose. They know their history and they're making that point on purpose. And I know, at least from my own personal realm, that I've heard people complain about, why are they shutting down the highways? And that to me is a signal that there hasn't been enough work done around teaching that history, because that's exactly, that's done on purpose as an attack on that structural racist structure that we have in this country that isn't going anywhere. Those highways are not going to get torn down and rebuilt. And those communities are gone that were once vibrant.
So this is not about making you feel bad, just to talk about no blame, no guilt, no shame. This is hopefully meant to be a call to action to maybe unpeeling blinders. It depends. Everybody has very different experiences. We don't know you and how much work you've already done and how much of this is new or not new to you. But we're all on a journey, and because we've all been shaped by our social group identities and things like where we grew up and where we went to school and who we had. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum was the former president of Spelman, and she has an amazing metaphor that was really helpful to me about systemic racism. That is, systemic racism is like a moving walkway at the airport, and we are all on it, whether we want to be on it or not, we're all on it. And some people are walking faster than the moving walkway, and those would be the active racists. So if you think KKK, white supremacists, there are people walking who are pushing that agenda. Most people are just standing on the walkway, but the walkway is still carrying us, whether we want to be there or not. Some people, though, have decided to turn around and walk in the opposite direction of the walkway, and that's partially why we entitled this anti-racism. So it's an acknowledgement that, number one, it's not my fault. I didn't create this whole thing. It's like 500 years old and more. Number two, I'm complicit, probably more than I recognized. And number three, I have to do something about it. And Maya Angelou has another quote. It's like, if you know better, you do better, something about that. So most of us were lied to in school, in textbooks. And her analogy about anti-racism, about turning in the opposite direction, was really helpful to me. And then I heard another trainer say, and other people are getting the tools out and dismantling the walkway.
Taking it apart altogether.
Yeah. And so let's just reflect for a little bit on almost 250 years of the government of this country, how white and how male the federal government has been. So we've got presidents, we've got the Senate. You can see 98% white, 96% male. The House of Representatives. I know that we just got 30 women in the House. I haven't updated since this most recent election, but I was shocked, 99.98% male. The Supreme Court, we've had 220 years of 88 to 100% white. And 192 years of 100% male. So this is what systemic means, is who's been making the decisions for this country? Who had the money and the power? And then it applies to governors as well. Illinois has never had a female governor. We have a female lieutenant governor. It's very exciting, elect. And then intersectionality, if you see on the bottom left there have only been 2 female governors of color and 1 lesbian. So even when we get to gender, an approachment of gender equity, it's not intersectional. It's only been white women, really.
And it continues into our corporate leadership. So if we look at the Fortune 500 leadership, only 24 women of the 500 companies have women at the top. And of the 24, only 2 of them are women of color. None of them are African American. Those 2 are Indian. And so the reasons why really vary, but Ursula Burns was the last female African American CEO of Xerox, the last Fortune 500 CEO. And one of the things that she really has expounded on are the talent pipelines we have for women of color to even get to the top echelons of these companies. And it really requires multiple people along the way to take chances on women of color. And so we like to hold up people when they get that, like in Ursula Burns, like, see, she made it, so why doesn't everyone else make it? Well, really, that's not systemic. She had a lot of luck along the way, and she's the first to say that. So we need to do better with creating and coddling our talent pipelines for women of color. And oftentimes when we think about where women of color can operate in workspaces, it's oftentimes supporting roles. And when we think about the nursing and teaching, that was really relegated for women as well. Women of color were often secretaries. And so they've had these supporting roles, which comes into play in the next slide I'll bring up as well. It becomes a problem when you want to try to promote women within organizations. And that women of color specifically have a double outsider role. First of all, they're not a man and they're not white. So they have to play to two separate power structures at all times in order to advance. And that's really tiring. It's really hard to do on a daily basis. It's really hard to do when you're the only one potentially in the organization. It's really hard to do when no one is thinking about your spot at the table except for you. And so you're often left to kowtow to both of those powers. And you can't get that far when you're just that tired. It's very difficult. So again, this is the picture of Ursula Burns' fight. And the last time when she resigned, it was in 2016. That's the last time we've had an African American woman column of the Fortune 500. And so that obviously structures down into pay. We've all sort of run into equal pay issues, I'm sure, in our employment. And there are federal protections for that. There are state protections, and there are some city protections. But I think it's really powerful to know that when we talk about equal pay, oftentimes we stop at what white women earn as compared to white men. It's even worse for women of color, and it's different among women of color. So if you take a look at the graphs, you can kind of see, and I won't drill down into the Illinois data because I think we're a little short on time, but they make even less, yeah. And so from the federal perspective, we do have an Equal Pay Act and the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. The one thing that I wanted to say here for anyone who is in the position of interviewing, the city of Chicago has now enacted, under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, enacted a stop on asking any prospective applicant about their salary history. And that's really important because if you think about women of color in particular having these supporting roles in their employment history, their salaries are generally less. And so asking about salary history is another way to systematize their lower pay. And so just not asking those questions takes that off the table right off the bat.
So we're going to do just a quick land acknowledgement, which this is a very cool website. It's another tool actually, where you can put in your zip code and you can look all around the country and you can highlight individual nations, and it'll highlight because they're often overlapping. A land acknowledgement is also something you can do at meetings, and I'm happy to share this one if you're interested. I want us to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. Recognizing that we are on unceded, occupied land is important because it acknowledges that the present United States of America is a collection of chopped up territories and land purchases accumulated by genocide. We are thankful to be able to be here and have this event on the ancestral homelands of the people of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, and Sauk. We must all be aware of our role in colonialism. Remembering the history and honoring the contributions and traditions of Indigenous peoples is one step toward fighting their erasure. We pay respect to the elders past and present and extend our recognition to their descendants. So there's about 65,000 Native people in the Chicagoland area. There's a very vibrant American Indian Center near Kimball and Lawrence. They have an art gallery that's always rotating exhibits and free. And they're very, very welcoming. I, in learning about land acknowledgements, started to realize how little I knew about who used to live here and who still lives here. Chicago is the third largest Native population of any urban center, so outside of a reservation. And part of that is because of the 1956 Indian Relocation Act, where the government was trying to steal more land from Native people and move them all to cities and break up families. And if you don't know much about the boarding schools and how children were ripped apart from their families, these were not privileged, nice boarding schools. There was a tremendous amount of sexual violence that happened to them, but children, their hair was cut, they were forbidden from speaking their languages, they were stripped from their family at 4 and 5 years old. So most of us were lied to. So again, this is not about making you feel bad, but thank you for signing up for a workshop on anti-racism. This book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, it's actually the second edition, originally about 20 years old, brilliant. He analyzes American history high school textbooks and how much we were lied to, using the word savages. How many current textbooks still describe Native people as savages, uses the passive voice to paint the white colonial settlers as the victims and the natives as the aggressors. And so making a commitment to learning some more accurate history, there's 2 recommendations here, and Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, absolutely brilliant. I know the Chicago Public Library, I believe, has both of these on Hoopla, so it's free downloadable audiobooks. If you have a commute, you can listen to them. Different Mirror by Ronald Takaki, brilliant. Both of them are absolutely brilliant. And so our last tool
is the racial equity analysis. And so I'm going to highlight each one as I go through them, so you're not reading all the text.
Or maybe we just tell them about it because it's really short on time. And
sure.
Basically that it's 6 questions. It's a series of questions.
It's a series of questions to help you when you are making a decision in your organization. It's not for every decision. Sometimes I've worked with schools on when they're making a large procurement decision that they should be thinking about more who should be at the table. It's really a process for inclusivity, how to include more people at the table, how to make the playing field level, who will the decision affect, how will you implement it, and who will implement it. I think that's actually missing from that question. And how will you keep people accountable? And the people who might be marginalized in this decision, how do you make that reporting and accountability safe for them to report back up?
So very quickly, we introduced at least 6, actually more like 7 or 8 tools that we're happy to email with links. The racial equity analysis, the last one, there's many different versions. There's ones that are longer and shorter. And part of it is just coming with a lens of racial equity and asking the question, who is at the table? Who's represented? Who's not at the table? Who's not represented? Specifically like Indigenous folks. Have you ever met anyone?
Right, and why they're not represented.
Yes. And what do we do about it? So if we want to be anti-racist, we have to take more action. There is a powwow tonight that I'm going to attend if anybody would like to meet myself in person and my 10-year-old daughter and some Native folks in Chicago at UIC. 6 p.m. Email me and I'll give you the information. So we introduced the privilege wheel, Robin DiAngelo's frames, the implicit bias test, the continuum on becoming an anti-racist multicultural institution, the 4 dimensions of racism framework, which is helpful as, again, for conversation at your workplace or any family group or church setting or any religious home or school, and then the racial equity analysis. And so we can have a couple brief questions, and we're happy to stay on a little bit longer if people want to, but we wanted to respect your time, and thank you so much for being with us.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
With Thanksgiving coming up and knowing that many of us may come from families where these conversations would be extremely useful, but some more, we'll call them hard-headed, I think that's being generous, people may say that conversations like this are veering towards being too politically correct, or that people who are on the receiving end of discrimination, who say that they are being, quote, too sensitive or misinterpreting their experiences, which this is not my opinion, but I've heard this from other people. Is there a way to sort of crack the egg open and get past that attitude so that there can be productive conversations and no food throwing?
Yeah.
On the interpersonal level.
I'll be honest, somebody asked me yesterday. Oh, no, I won't say what I was going to say. Never mind. Yes, one technique, and I'm not expert at this either, it's very, very challenging. One technique has been that growth mindset piece of sharing your own journey, of just saying something like, do you know, I attended this webinar this week that I had no idea, and whatever XYZ thing that was new to you. I've been finding it's fairly disarming because it's non-threatening. It's just like, did you know that there were 65,000 Native people in Chicago? I just learned that this woman is collecting signatures to try to get Columbus Day changed to Indigenous Peoples Day. Wouldn't that be, did you know that like 50 cities around the country have done it already, and 4 states, and why do we have Columbus Day anyway? I don't know. It's not easy. It's not easy. There are some great YouTube clips and websites around Native people's opinions around Thanksgiving. It's a really beautiful one that I had my daughter and my cousin's children watch on Thanksgiving last year, and it was just really powerful. It's about probably 30 different Native people, a couple of sentences each, sort of giving their thoughts about Thanksgiving. So again, sharing your own journey of just, I never thought about it before, and I'm starting to think about it now, and that we're all lied to.
I think too, one of the things that I've used to sort of, when race comes up as the topic of conversation, it can make people very uncomfortable. And so sometimes I'll pivot to gender, because sometimes that's an easier example to use. And one of the things that I'll say is, like, for example, in our history classes, a number of us were taught that women were given the right to vote versus women fighting for the right to vote, and that there was really a plane of struggle there. And just because the vote was won doesn't mean the plane of struggle ended. And it's really important to affirm those stories, to affirm that history. And that's one way to get to the crux of, we need to believe people when they're telling their story. That's really, we need to believe them. That's kind of the beginning and end of it. So if I say something happened to me and it felt racialized, the first response I get back should be, I hear you and I believe that's what you're experiencing. And that's one way to kind of get at because we do that naturally for white people.
So, so Sarah and Miriam, one of the things that I do often ask that question of, where are you from? I'm a first generation American, so even though I look very white and Caucasian, I feel different than a lot of people, right? So I asked that question, and I know that you talked about that and I'm kind of struggling with that. Sometimes it helps me orient to understanding more about them and their background, and also creating a connection in terms of, and so like I'm just like, I'm caught up in how do I be PC without being perceived as somebody who is racially profiling you?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to think less about the PC part of it. I think like when I run into this question, and my answer is different depending on who's asking it and when they're asking it, right? There is some situational leeway to that question. That's not a hard yes or a hard no to when you can ask that question. It's really thinking about being empathetic to the person you're asking, and understanding that they may not want that information collected. Even though you want to make that connection, they may not be at the same place you are. So I think really reflecting on why you're collecting that information, and if there's another way to make a connection before you lead into the piece of it. Especially if that person hasn't shared it with you yet. That's a signal that they may not be comfortable yet.
And I'll be honest, when I first met Miriam, I had no idea, and I wasn't sure. And I didn't ask, because it's really none of my business, even though I was kind of curious. I don't know, talked a bit before I said, you know, I have Greek heritage. My grandfather immigrated from Greece. Do you mind sharing your background and like how you identify racially? Because we were beginning to develop a relationship. So I think a lot of it, not only situational, agreed, but also dynamics of is there an age gap? Is there a power dynamic in terms of employer-employee?
Right.
Is it a familial? I mean, there's just different dynamics.
Right. So I would specifically say in the context of employer-employee, especially in an interview process, not a good idea to say, where are you from? Right. And there was a video that had gone around with sort of that snippet of like, you're just trying to collect the information that you're actually legally not allowed to collect about me. And so that's a very power dynamic driven. So I think that's really important in your question too, trying to get at that.
Yeah, for me it's not a power thing, it's just
right.
Curiosity.
It's curiosity. Yeah,
especially when people have accents. It's like, oh, where are you from? You know, have I ever been there? That you've been to, you know, that kind of thing.
And it's can other people as not American. And so sometimes I will wait quite a while, but I'll also sometimes ask, so did you grow up in Chicago? And it's just less, where are you from? It's not those words. It's like, I grew up in Chicago. Did you grow up in Chicago? And I think Chicago has a particular thing about Chicago, which is like, where'd you go to high school? That can also be outing people who didn't grow up here and who aren't from here. But I usually just try to wait and not ask initially. Thank you so much for having us. We're happy to stay on a little longer, but if people have their lunch hour wrapping up, I don't want to keep anybody, but we'll send all the resources to Kate.
Great.
And if you're watching this recorded later, you can be in touch with us. You have our emails at the end.
Yeah, and thank you guys so much. People in the chat have asked for where they can get access to that YouTube video about
Sure. I would say just Google it. I mean, I can look for it too, but I just Googled
The Thanksgiving one?
Yeah, Native
I might have
Americans
it,
on Thanksgiving. Google's your friend. That would be another tip actually for everybody, to try to not always ask the people of color the questions that we want to know about a Native tradition of, powwow or
to do your work.
a particular question, a word. Is it okay to say that word or not? A lot of people of color have already written things that are public and free. And so to try not to ask initially and look around first is a lesson that we can all learn.
Great. And I'll let everyone know if a link to the petition is on the event on the Women Belong website, where you registered for today's event. It's there. And yeah, thank you so much. This was.
And if anybody's interested in more information, be in touch with me. I'm always looking for volunteers to go down to speak to the CPS Board of Ed, including this coming Wednesday is the next event.
And Sarah, please resend that. It was almost a prayer to the native land.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I would really love that. I mean, I think it's a beautiful thing for us to share at Thanksgiving as
Yes.
well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you, ladies.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everybody.